Thank you so much. We give the appearance of flexibility by acting like we're just making this up as we go. It's wonderful to be with you. I've been in Singapore. We've been here a day, and then I once came to Singapore for one day. This is 20 years ago on my honeymoon, actually. So other than that, I don't know the city at all, but I'm really enjoying it, and it's been a great delight to be here. Can I just quickly find out who you are? I know you guys know who each other are. But so we had some how many Presbyterians do we have here? Okay. How many Baptists do we have here? How many non-denominational people do we have here? Oh, quite a lot. Okay. And then, the others who are not one of those three, where? Where? I'm not going to get into this. I'm going to be in trouble. What anywhere that's not one of those three? Where? Okay, wonderful. Assemblies of God. Okay. Any others? Okay, that's just helpful context for me, just to understand. We're Baptists, we're not denominationally Baptists, but we baptise believers. So that's our church. Our church is actually planted by Charles Spurgeon, and as part of his ministry in London in the late 19th century. He wasn't the pastor, but it was his sort of preaching church planting ministry that started our church. And I've been there for just under 10 years with Steve and Deb, which is brilliant. And they've been there for 30, and it's just a fantastic church. And we are in a very sort of post-Christian sort of setting. Actually, London is more Christian than the rest of the UK, but it's probably less Christian than Singapore, and the nation as a whole is certainly. But obviously, our roots are very Christian, so we have an interesting dynamic where our culture is still remembering. It's got a sort of Christian, a very strong Christian presence in it, which is gradually sort of faded as fewer people have gone to church, but has left us with quite a pronounced post-Christian legacy. And I know that won't map directly onto your setting, but it is quite similar to what you have in almost all of, certainly Western and much of Europe, and obviously North America as well, which means, as Simon was saying, that its sort of cultural exports are still sort of got this sort of the legacy of Christianity gradually sort of diminishing, but a lot of Christian assumptions within it that nevertheless don't correspond to people actually going to church a lot. And so lots of people might not believe Jesus is alive, but they will also continue to act and assume all sorts of things that only really make sense within a Christian way of thinking about the world. And we'll touch on some of those things as we go, but I don't want to assume that directly translates to your setting. So I'm not going to, so some of the stuff I would do in Europe, I wouldn't do here. But I imagine there's some overlap as well. And we'll talk about that. So I wondered if a way to start might be just to think a little bit about, I will introduce you, I suppose, to the story that is told within my culture. This is a very silly version, but the story that's told as it is in my culture, which I would call a post-Christian story, and then to try and find out to what extent this maps onto yours. So this is the kind of people that I think who are not believers. Most people who come to my church on a Sunday are Christians, but we know from surveys we do that about 10% of people who are in our church on a Sunday are not Christians. And depending on your church, there might be lower, it might be a lot higher. There's some settings where lots of people who come are just not saved and wouldn't think they were. But this is a sort of a quick summary, this kind of character. I actually borrowed this from some friends of mine who worked with Tim Keller for years, and who've used this as a way of trying to tell it. But I quite like the idea of almost trying to encapsulate the story that people were trying to preach to or reach, live in. And this is a sort of a very simplistic telling of the story. Obviously, no one would actually tell it this way, but I think it can be quite a helpful way of picturing what some of these key words are. These words you can see on the screen. So the post-Christian story, so people in Britain, and again, this might map very well, it might not really, onto the people that you would meet if you walk down the street and interviewed them. But they would say at the heart of what you do, you have to do what makes you happy. That this is the goal of life. That's really what you're trying to. That's what people are trying to do. That's what they're trying to live out. And happiness is really a question of finding out who you are on the inside, and then living according to that. You've got to live in line with who you truly are. You've got to live in line with your identity, and being true to yourself. Finding out who that inner you is, and making sure you live in line with that. And unhappiness is caused by a dissonance between the person you are in here and the way you live and the expectations you live. That's the plot of every Disney movie, isn't it? I mean, literally every Disney movie is that. Even if Disney movies are whatever, there might be Marvel movies, or they might be, or cartoons for 5-year-olds, but they're all doing all of us are unhappy if we are, because we're somehow not living true to who we are on the inside. And so the plot, it's actually the plot in some ways of Romeo and Juliet. It's just in Romeo and Juliet, everyone dies. So it's more obvious that it isn't necessarily a good idea, whereas in Disney, Romeo and Juliet leads happily ever after. So that's where you go. And so that is basically finding out your identity, which is on the inside, and living true to that. In our culture, this has been a big issue. I imagine it's true to some degree here as well. Your sexual desires are especially important to who you are. So, and that has become, in the last 50 years, a larger and larger part of the story. And so, obviously, your identity is bound to be bound up with your sexuality and what you want to who you want to be sexually. And that's why personal freedom is so important, because the story of mainstream culture is that as you gain more and more freedom, you have more and more possibility of living in line with who you are. And because sex is a big part of that story, that it's very important no one tries to tell you those things, which is a major objection in my culture to Christianity. That's one of the biggest reasons why people have a problem with Christianity, because we don't absolutize freedom in that sense. We don't think, we actually do. We believe in more freedom, not less, but we don't picture freedom in this way. You get to do whatever you want and sleep with who you like is not a Christian vision, which I'm sure I don't need to persuade you of here. So no one can tell you that your desires are wrong, because that would deny you ultimate happiness. So this is where so a lot of the time we're actually I've got a job to do of using this as a way of helping people understand the gospel, but these are also the objections that people are living with in response to the gospel. So as you preach and talk and so on about, even within people within our church, let alone people outside the church, one of the major objections people have is that as soon as I tell you that something you deeply want to do is an ungodly or an inappropriate thing to want, I'm denying you ultimate happiness. And that's the objection. That's one of the biggest problems people have. And so there's then a connection from that to the need to work for justice so that everyone can live as they choose. And again, justice in my culture would be quite often understood as emancipation, or the capacity for everybody to live as they want. And so the narrative would be that some people have always been, usually, white men have always been able to do what they want, and justice is a process of having more and more people allowed to live as they want. And so that's quite an important part of the story. So everyone can live as they choose. When it comes to knowledge, the only way you can really know anything is through science. That's what true knowledge is under. Now that's probably less. As you go higher up the educational pyramid, people become more convinced of that. There's more, particularly in North America, there's more skepticism about science, particularly in the last few years, actually, since the pandemic. But even so, I think most people think that truth established through science is of a much higher value than truth established through religious or philosophical claims. Everyone who claims ultimate truth is making a claim for power. So this is why I'm one of the baddies, right? Because if I'm a Christian pastor, and in my case, a Christian pastor who's also a white man, I'm the ultimate I'm trying to get power over everybody all the time. This is what I do. I'm trying to appropriate power from you by just telling you your moral framework should be, and I'm using the authority of the Word of God to do it. And that's my challenge. As soon as I begin to preach, I'm pushing against some quite deeply held assumptions that my culture hold, because I'm declaring this is what God says. But people say, of course you're not really saying what God says. You're really saying what you want people to do, and using God as a means to do it. And they are also, by the claim of ultimate truth, resisting our inevitable progress, which is the seventh key word here, towards a world of individual autonomy and freedom. Now, no one would actually state that sentence, that paragraph, in an unqualified fashion, because anyone who is really thinking those things in that way is probably aware enough to realize that some of those statements don't sound as convincing when you put them under the spotlight. Actually, in some ways, the less someone is likely to say those things, the more they're likely to believe them. So as in, that is not how, but a lot of ordinary people in our culture would have a vague idea that is the sort of way the world is, or that they would believe it was, even if they wouldn't necessarily narrate it quite like that. They might not know that they believe those things, but deep down, lots of those assumptions are there. And you'll get all sorts of variants, right? So there will be lots of people who, because of their religious history, would hold quite strongly to 5 of those and not to the other 2. There might be people, as I say, in North America, you might get people who had lots of questions about the portrayal of science and justice in that setup, but not of the other 5. And so you might get people more on the sort of, right-leaning backlash kind of side of in America, who would say several of those, yes, absolutely, but several of them, no. And then you might have some who their background is Muslim, and they would actually have 3 or 4 of them, but not the other 2 or 3, and they might have some strong reservations about some, but still the sort of broad culture might reflect where they are. And then you'd have, of course, have some pockets of communities where people would almost reject all 7. And for the same reasons we do, it's just from a different religious tradition. So there are plenty of people who obviously, you're not talking to secular people, you're talking to people who are committed and convinced Muslims or whatever it might be. But so what I don't know is how well that maps onto what people would think here. So I'm introducing you to my culture in a kind of cartoonish way. But if you were going to do the equivalent for yours, how well does that map? Or where would you say of those 7 words on this sort of or this picture, which of those would you say? Oh yeah, in Singapore, that's clearly that's the same. There's a lot of overlap here. And which of them would you say? No, not really in the same way. But this other word would be added to that list. So I'm going to ask you to do something. So you're sitting on tables, which is very kind of whoever's laid the room out, Dara, I guess. Could you just, on your table, would you mind just going, if I had to sort of qualify that picture for my context, which words might I say? That, you know what, that's not such a big thing, but I think this is a bigger thing. I would add this word, or I would take that one away, or no, that's exactly the same, or whatever. Would you mind just doing that? You might be in a 2 or a 4 or something on your table. Just give it 2 minutes, just turning to the person near you and saying, this is how I would, if I was using that in my own context, these are the things I'd change. Okay, I know that is a very short period of time to talk about some big things, but I'd love to hear any kind of comments or observations. I'm aware that there may even be bandwidth in this room. Some people saying, "Oh no, that's," or even that describes some of my 20-somethings very well and is completely unlike my 50-somethings. I don't know, but what kind of things? How would you modify that if you were describing people in your church? Anybody want to go? Anyone can help me at least by translating this into Singaporean context. What were you discussing? What kind of comments did you have on your table? Yes.
Yeah, I think maybe for the first sentence, you have to make you have to do what makes you happy. Ultimately, you have to do what makes your parents
Yeah.
your family happy.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. So it's a less individualistic take on this stuff. Brilliant. Okay. That makes sense. Other comments.
Happiness does not come from heart and living to yourself. I think happiness comes from being rich, being recognized, being successful.
Okay. So achievements, status, wealth. Very good. Very helpful. Education, training, achievement. Well done. Great. Any others?
We spoke about how, because I'm in Mandarin ministry, so I think this is quite nuanced for us. The thing probably will resonate most is that people from PRC, China, will be like, anything can be no need to science.
Yeah.
Because of the atheistic and materialistic background. But on the other hand, for Chinese culture in general, I guess depends how I define happiness, but we can all three. I guess we are happy to be servants and slaves as long as there's money. So I guess. As blunt as it is. So personal, but it could be a generational thing as well. So we spoke about this. So the younger people in Singapore in general, not just Chinese-speaking people, would probably identify with this a lot more.
Right.
50s and 60s and above, they were probably more, I don't know if you use the term, more modernistic rather than post-modernistic. So
Yeah.
they'll be less of the...
Very helpful. Okay, that's really okay. So there's a generational transition occurring, which is true in the West as well. Of course, it's true in Britain too. But that's very. But it's more pronounced here, I'm sure. But that's really interesting. That thing we do. What was the statement? We don't mind being slaves so long as we've got money. Was that?
I mean, you can work yourself to death, right? But then I get my happiness from looking at my bank account.
Okay.
Looking at how much I can provide my children, how I appear to be a very good dad.
Yeah.
I can get a nice house for my family to live in. But I don't mind saving on my work until I die.
Right. Okay.
I mean, that's a very concrete example.
Sure. No, that's very helpful. One more. Let's have any other table, any other comments that you would. Okay. Okay, so that would be a much smaller part of the story. Okay, very good. That's really helpful for me. And I hope in some ways the exercise might be helpful for anybody, because in principle this could work with, you could start with that in Yemen and say, what's the story? And people say all of those are different in Yemen. And so, but it's just quite helpful to kind of, and I think that generational thing is fascinating, and probably even the brother who was sharing about the church and say, start with your youth ministry. This may well be more true for people who are still at school and university and that sort of thing. And I imagine it will become those of us who've been ministering for many decades who find, I recognize this more now than I did. And this is certainly what is being exported in a lot of any kind of Western cultural artifacts, but whether to the extent to which that lands where you are will obviously vary. But to me, it's a helpful exercise in some ways to kind of summarize that story for the people that you are trying to speak to, isn't it? And even if this is completely different. And so when I do this in a Western setting, I'll ask even like, what is good or true or beautiful about this, and what's true about all of those things? And lots is, right? All 7 of those things have got, as I alluded to, have got their roots in Christianity in all sorts of ways. And several of them would not be central to any account of the reality that wasn't rooted in Christianity. You just wouldn't have a belief in progress, which is obviously in a Western setting is a very important idea, but you don't get that in non-Christian influenced cultures. That's just not the shape of history. It might be more cyclical, or it might even be decline. But the idea that the world is always going to get it's actually a Christian idea. It's based on our eschatology. And so lots of these things are kind of good desires and assumptions that people have, which have come from Christianity, but then Christianity has been eroded and people still want the thing, but they don't have the means to get the thing. And then as a result, they find other ways of reaching for it, and that helps me understand it. And so the questions I would apply in our setting here would be different, but hopefully it can still be a useful exercise. This is a more kind of cartoonish thing, which you really do see people in the West. Now, this, I imagine, is not something that this yard sign doesn't exist in Singapore, I expect, right? People don't have yards from what I've seen anyway, so they certainly don't have yard signs. But again, this is a sort of, very, the thing I would point out here is just how Christian, this is, again, coming from the West, right? So if you people reading or seeing or watching a lot of what's being produced by Western people and social media, YouTube or anything like that, a lot of it will embody something like this. In this house we believe, Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no humans illegal, science is real, love is love, kindness is everything. That's the sort of thing that you see people walk into coffee shops in my hometown, my city, with things like that tattooed on the backs of their legs or on their arms. These are very deeply held beliefs, even, and of course you notice they're all on the face of it, they're all true, even if sometimes they're reaching for public policy issues, solutions that aren't necessarily Christian, but they're all true as they stand. But also they're very Christian in their origins. Several of the fruits of the Spirit appear on that yard sign, which is just interesting. Like that is, if you speak to sort of ancient people, and actually I suspect in large parts of the world today, in Islamic cultures or in Confucian context, or also the idea of love and kindness might be understood differently, or they might not be prioritized at all in the sense of virtues. That's certainly in the ancient pagan West, the Christian virtues were not a major part of it. But in a post-Christian setting, people are very interested in the Christian values, and also very interested in creeds. Even we believe these are the things we say that we believe, because we're justified by faith and not by works. And so the idea that I believe these things is very important, even if I don't do them, which is quite a Protestant idea. And it's just interesting how that's, in that sense, the West is very Protestant. And this is, again, is what's probably being exported. Again, it will be different here. But the exercise in some ways just to understand, okay, so what kinds of things do people hold as quite deeply held ideas around here might help. So that's when I'm talking about preaching in a post-Christian setting, or preaching in a secular setting, that's the kind of thing I'm doing. What I'm going to do for a minute, though, is talk about... This is how many people have seen this kind of thing before? Like we touched on this. We asked our team here yesterday about how many people have talked about the Engel scale, and no one had come across it. So it might be an idea you've never heard of. I don't know. Anybody here used this kind of thing before? That a handful. Okay. So this, I like this because when comes to preaching, this can help me understand it's a sort of framework for thinking about people's journey to Christianity. And again, forgive me, this is very much aimed at people in my kind of community, and I just don't know what the journey people would go on here is. But I imagine, again, there's some overlap. And the premise behind it is that basically everybody who's not a Christian is somewhere on a scale from 1 to 10. And there's different variants. Sometimes people do the scale negatively, whatever, but I'll just give it simple, 1 to 10. Starting from people who might have a very negative view of God and Jesus and Christianity and everything, through to people who are repented, believed, baptized, filled with the Spirit, and so on. And there's a sort of a long process that might, in some cases, people might get from 1 to 10 in the space of a few minutes. And God powerfully breaks into their lives, and that may have happened to you. I think there is a sense in which there will be a handful of people whose testimonies sound like they almost went from 1 to 10 nearly in an instant. But most people don't. Most people, that process might actually take months or even years to get from 1 to 10. Or they may never have been at 1. So 1 is negative view of God, Jesus, everything. So in my context, that would be you use the word Jesus as a swear word. You don't think well of God at all. You don't think well of Christians at all. You don't know any Christians. The ones you have encountered are television caricatures who are not admirable at all. And you might, by meeting one person who is a Christian who you like, even if every other Christian is still an idiot and God still doesn't exist and you still see Jesus as a swear word, but you've moved from step 1 to step 2. You're nowhere near this. And this person never comes to church and wouldn't. It would never occur to them they might for a wedding. But why would you go? And that's fine. But even in getting to know you, they have stepped a tiny bit closer. And level 3, they might have met a few others. And some of them are okay. But they've still got a negative view of religion, of church, of God, and whatever. And step 4, they may by now, so I've got friends of mine who I would say might have started at 1 or 2, and as a result of friendship with me, might be now at 4. But they're still nowhere near this. And I might invite them to something, and actually, because I write books, I can sometimes I can cheat. I can say I've written this, and they will humour me, and they might even read it, or they might read a bit of it, or whatever. But they're not the people to whom, if you invite them to something at church, they're not interested. But they're actually nowhere near as far away from that, and they might in 5 years' time meet another Christian who then they go, oh, okay, and then they go to here or whatever. But this sort of process, right? By level 5, they might acknowledge some Christian beliefs, but still be fairly against them. But they might be able to have a conversation about what those beliefs are, even if they say, this is why I don't believe it. But I'm open to the idea, and I don't dislike the people. And they might actually, by 6, be prepared to discuss Jesus or Christian beliefs or practice, but they're still doubtful. They may get to a point of inquiry. That's quite a big jump there. From I'm skeptical to I'm inquiring, I'm curious, but not convinced. And then they might get to a point of seriously investigating Christianity. And at this point, you start saying, I think the Holy Spirit's at work in this. But actually, the Spirit is at work in many ways in all of these processes. But there's a moment where you can think, I think God is on, I don't know what language you'd use, but God is on the case of this person or something. You can see something is waking up inside them, that they were asking things they weren't before. They're prepared to entertain. The conversation lasts longer than it did before. And then they may, at this point, might be a time when they are prepared to, in our context, we use the Alpha course. Do people here use that? Do people use inquiring courses, like Exploring Christianity, those sort of things? This is a sort of a good setting for people in that, but by the time they're even starting the course, they've already come a long way from here. Or they may have actually, because they're parents, they may have started their life here. But now they're here and they're thinking about it. And then, of course, the last bit, which is the bit that we get rightly really excited about, is the bit when they go from 9 to 10, and actually they're in, and when we celebrate baptism. But actually that final step, as much as it reflects the miracle of new birth, in many ways, on the sort of the face of their journey, that step might not have been as big a step as the one they went from there to there, in terms of how surprising it was or how long it took. And so for me, this has been a very helpful. It's just helped me on a number of levels, because it's helped me as a preacher, because I realize that actually the thing that we do when we summon people to repentance is vital, but actually often it's not necessarily a failure if somebody in the course of your preaching ministry has gone from there to there or there to there. or even just in your evangelistic ministry, or you're with your neighbours, or the parents of the children in your child's class, that sort of thing. If it may well be that they have gone from there to there through their friendship with you, that is for them a very significant thing that might compare to someone coming along on a course for the first time, or going to a Bible study, or obviously this is the one, in some ways this is the one that really matters, but it's only possible because lots of people in your church, in your community, are doing all the other bits. And I've found, even as we talk to people in our church and talk to pastors, it can sometimes lift guilt off people. In fact, it often does, because there's some people who are brilliant at doing this. That's almost their life's work. But they say, I'm terrible at evangelism, they say, because I've never done this. I've never got to be the person who prays the prayer. And then you get other people who are like, that person's amazing at evangelism. They see so much fruit because they're always doing this. But actually, they would often be the first to tell you, yeah, but that's only possible because loads of other people in my church are doing this. And obviously, there are a handful of people, like my mother-in-law, who seem to be very good at get people here and gradually just pray for them until they're there. And there are people, of course, churches have those people too, and God willing, you do. But many of us would say, as a person, I excel in a particular part of that scale, and that's often what God has given me to do. And by the grace of God, he gives us a church where people have all kinds of different gifts and different strengths. So to me, this is a comment about evangelism more generally, but it really helps when it comes to the issue of preaching, because I then realize, the people I'm preaching to, again, there will be some of these would vary from my context to yours, but probably the principles of people gradually getting closer. I then know, most people are not even coming to church unless they're already at, certainly they've got to be at around 6 in order to come at all. And in our setting, big Christian, except at Christmas, where in Britain, some people at Christmas, some people are friends of ours who are at level 4, we invite to church and they come at Christmas. Even though the rest, they wouldn't come on a regular Sunday until they're at about 7. That may not translate here at all, but there might be settings where it's easier. They might come here if someone they knew was getting baptized or something. And so this to me just helps when it comes to the issue of who am I preaching to and where have they gone, where have they been already? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, Pascal's other triangle. So I you guys are obviously all big on Pascal and his triangles, no doubt. I like shapes. So this is now beginning to just think through. So there's a couple of foundational things: understanding the culture and community we're in, and what that story that people are telling is, which obviously you would know far better than me. And then the dynamics that are in play whenever people are approaching Jesus on a journey of preaching sort of for salvation. But this to me now, and some of us will have come across this how many people have read Pascal? They've come across this idea before. 1. Okay, good. This will be new-ish then. Some of us may have seen this. This often gets sort of channeled. Tim Keller uses this quite a lot, or used this quite a lot. But I think it's really, really helpful. And this is the money quote, which to me is a lot of what I think I'm trying to do when I'm preaching to secular people, which, as I say, 1 in 10 of the people in my church broadly are. And certainly when I'm talking evangelistically to people who are not outside of the church. This is in Pascal's book, The Pensée. Men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it might be true. The cure for this is first to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it was true, then show that it is. Pascal said. In other words, what you don't do is start by trying to tell people this is why Christianity is true, because they won't listen. Because they don't think it's worth respect, and they don't want it to be true. And when you don't want something to be true, you don't give the time of day to finding out whether it is. You do give the time of day to finding out whether something's true when you want it to be true but aren't convinced that it is. And so often what happens with, depending on, I would say particularly in people who would even use language like gospel-centered preaching, which we all would, that culturally we have often excelled much more at that, the logos or the logic, the showing why it's true bit. So we're actually good at that. That's it's a real strength. We love doing that. I love it. That's my natural, and I want to convince people of things. But then actually, if we haven't previously done the work on its credibility and its emotional satisfaction, we might be making a very convincing case and people just don't want to know. They don't care because they don't want it to be true. because it doesn't sound like it would be good news if it was. And so if I went back to, in my context, the reason why it doesn't sound like good news is because of this. So they're living in this story, and as soon as I start saying Jesus rose from the dead or God is real, that sounds to them like it would be bad news, not good news. Because God is a judge, and he's going to hold them accountable for their sin, and he's going to deny them personal happiness, and their identity won't be fully realized, and all those, they're not going to have the freedom they want. So it sounds like bad news. So before I start trying to convince them that those things are true, I have to try and show, or much of the time, I feel it's important that I try and show people why it would be good news if it was true. And so I heard this years ago and found it a really fascinating idea. I read Pascal and I thought, that really resonates with me. I can see that a lot of apologetics works very hard, particularly North American influenced apologetics, does a lot of work here and has often not been so effective here and almost completely unengaged here. Whereas I realize I watch these sort of debates online, or I watch people like Bill Craig, those sorts of guys make very, very convincing intellectual cases that no one in my city cared about. Because they just didn't want it to be true. They didn't care. I'm not going to give you the time to listen to whether that's true, because I just don't want it to be true. And when you don't want something to be true, you need a lot of evidence to be convinced that it is. You have to get dragged kicking and screaming to think about it. Whereas when you want something to be true, you don't require very much evidence sometimes. The bar is much higher for things that you don't want to believe than things you do. And as I say, I think I first came across this through Keller and then went to Pascal and found it really helpful. And then he's discovered it to be true even from the mouths of quite robust atheists as well, and then realized this is very important. So I was reading a book by the French philosopher Luc Ferry called A Brief History of Thought, which is quite an ambitious title. So I'm going to summarize everything human beings have thought ever. But it's a 300-page book, but it's an amazing sort of summary and very well done. And he's a French atheist philosopher and believes what you would think a French atheist philosopher would think about most things. But he gets towards the end, it's a 300-page book, and on somewhere around page 280 he says, the thing is, compared with all of the other religious and non-religious options available, nothing competes with Christianity's doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. The idea that there might be the possibility that I might get raised from the dead after I'm dead, that I might be reunited with my loved ones, that the destruction of death might be overcome in my life, and that I might live in eternity forever. That nothing competes with Christianity, except, he said, for the fact that I don't believe it. But if I was a believer, I would definitely be a taker, he says. And then he makes a very similar comment a few pages later. He says, the only problem is I don't believe it, but I wish it was true, is effectively what he's saying. I wish I believed it. Now, so Luc Ferry is actually, he's much closer to, he's an atheist philosopher, but he's much closer than a lot of people in my city or yours, because he's going, I've actually thought long and hard enough about what they are claiming in Christianity that this is a tick. Unfortunately, that's my problem, but I want this to be true. And I read it, I just thought I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that someone could be self-aware enough to make that comment and say, I don't believe it, but oh my, imagine if it was true. And it helped me because I realized when people actually understand what Christians are claiming about the world, there is no better news. In fact, there's no better news imaginable. It's not just that Christians are the only people who have a risen Saviour. It's Christians are the only people who claim they have a risen Saviour. No one else talks like that. It's not just that Christians are the people who are going to be resurrected. It's that Christians are the only people who talk like that there is going to be a resurrection from the dead. It's massive. And obviously, depending on your culture, the credibility ethos issues will vary dramatically. The things that people find ethically convincing, the obstacles to overcome to show that Christianity is worthy of reverence and respect. So in my city, I know what those things are. They will be different here. But those things where you go, that's the reason why people don't take this seriously. That's the reason why people think it doesn't work. But those things are also important. So as preachers, we're then thinking, my job is not limited to this. Because what I'm trying to do is simultaneously show people that it is convincing. But even before I land that point, I've often got to overcome a credibility gap and or an emotional gap that people just don't feel that why it would matter. Or they're just not listening yet. And that's fine. But those things are where I need to overcome and work. So my job is, in that sense, if you read New Testament letters, and don't worry, we will turn to Paul in the second session and think about how this works in one of his letters. But Paul is integrating these three all the time. He is showing why things are true, but he's also showing why they're emotionally and existentially satisfying, and he's showing why they are ethically or credible from a perspective of the way people live. And obviously that is, so even these words, ethos, pathos, logos, are drawn from Aristotle, and how you convince people of things. This is not just true of Christianity. This is just how you convince people of anything. It's what advertisers are trying to do. They're trying to say, of course, this product does these things. And, they're trying to sell you shampoo. And they have lots of sciencey gubbins on the, probably not a very good English word, lots of sciencey sort of background stuff on adverts when they're trying to sell you shampoo, with lots of sort of symbols and quotes and things from, you don't understand what they mean, I don't know what they mean, but what they're trying to convince you is this is convincing. But imagine they then got somebody very beautiful throwing their hair back, and it's meant to be an emotional thing, and there's a credibility issue as well. It's going to make your life better. They're always trying to do all three, because that's how persuasion happens. It's just when it comes to Christianity, if we're not careful, we're not thoughtful about it, we can spend all our time on this. We're not here and here. And I think that's Pascal's fantastic insight. And so just a few examples that I found very helpful, of just stories that have helped me with this. A British apologist called Michael Ramsden, who tells the story about when he was a child. He said, I didn't go to church until I was 18, because I went once as a child. I don't remember his age, 10, something like that. And he grew up on Cyprus, where lots of Greek Orthodoxy is the main expression of Christianity. He said, I went to church, and I walked in one day, and there was a man with a big hat and a long beard at the front, saying very solemnly, my heart is full, and my cup overfloweth. And he said, and I just didn't believe him. Which I just thought, my heart is full and my cup overflows. He was like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't look like it's true. In other words, he never got to this, because he's like, I just don't believe. I'm not seeing the kind of, were it true that your heart is full and your cup overflows with joy, you just wouldn't talk like that. It's like, I don't buy it. So Glenn Scrivener, who Simon very briefly mentioned in his introduction, friend of mine, actually my neighbour of mine, lives 100 yards from me, but is a really fascinating apologist and thinker. And he's talks about this through the lens of his own parents. He says, actually, for a lot of people, their Christian story amounts to, my parents told me that following Jesus was the most wonderful thing in life, and I watched their life for 20 years and eventually believed them. Because they actually lived as if what they said was true. And that's in many ways my testimony. That's how I came to Jesus. It's like my dad used to walk down at breakfast and say, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say, rejoice. That was my dad. But the thing is, after 20 years, I thought, both of my parents, they actually do rejoice in the Lord. Like they've said Jesus is worth following, and I've seen their life closely enough to go, yeah, that's it. So the most evangelistic thing you can do is rejoice in front of your children. Or just live the kind of life that you would if Christianity was true. And then Sam Albury, who might be a name known to others of you as well, but he was saying the way that we do this about Netflix shows and books. In fact, I've done it already on this trip with Steve and Deb, both about a book I loved and about a Netflix show I loved. I know you, and I love this, and I know you enough to know I think you might love it as well. That's actually what a lot of evangelism is saying, I know, and I love this, and I think you'll love it as well. But it's just a really interesting way of thinking about what we are doing when we preach or when we evangelize, as we're saying, there's a resonance here between my affections and yours, which means I feel like I've got enough permission to tell you this is what this has done in my life. Again, we're reaching here for the sort of issues of ethos and pathos before we're touching the issue of logos. And that's not what happens when you recommend a box set. Is that you don't start by saying, let me give you 11 reasons why this plot is brilliantly conceived and why you just don't tend to do that. You tend to bubble with the affection and the credibility, and then they go, so tell me more about it. And then you go, well, let me explain. And I think the same is true of preaching and evangelism. Let me just see if I've got time to do one more. I think I do. Let me just do it, and then we'll take a break, okay? Yeah, so basically, Steve has the thing that everything I do has to have a shape. So as soon as if there's a page, it has to have like some sort of wheel. This, I think, is technically not actually a circle. Is it a dodecahedron? Is that right? Some of you know more about math. Is a 12-sided, is that a 12-sided shape? I'm just sort of assuming that Singaporean people know a lot more about maths than I do. And I don't know whether... right. Yeah. Yes, with the one exception of this one, which I've been asked not to distribute. But that's just, I just want to honour them when I've used it. I've said, it actually even says in capital letters at the bottom left-hand corner, please do not distribute. So I just wanted to honour that. But yes, you're right, definitely all the others. This is, again, adapted from, so this is somebody who's, as part of Tim Keller's ministry in the last few years, has gone, this is just a graphic to try and represent 12 things. Now, again, which ones of these particularly land in your context? Maybe, as we saw in the very beginning, the different things may chime with people in your city as opposed to mine. But Christianity offers all of these things and many more besides. And I find it helpful because there are at least 12 and there's others. And whenever I've taught this before, you have people in the room going, here's a 13th or a 14th. There's lots of other things. But core human desires that are satisfied in Christianity. So there is, if I just start here with identity. So Christianity offers an identity that doesn't crush you or exclude other people. So most ways of forming, which is for a Westerner is very important because identity is really central, but most ways of forming identity work by bigging up my group and pushing down some other group. And obviously the only way of being given an identity that doesn't do those things is when that identity is not created by you, it's given to you by someone else. Love, a way to flourish in community and romantic relationships that are not exploitative or commodified. Reconciliation, a basis for forgiveness that honours justice and mercy. So in our city, through the context of race, that's a very important issue. Is that Christianity gives a way of causing people who have been historically opposed to be reconciled and brought to peace. Wholeness, a goodness of the physical world and ability to love your body. Justification. We're good Protestants, so we lean into this one a lot, but a solution to shame and guilt that it neither dismisses guilt nor treats it as indelible. So there is a solution here, it's just not to wave it away. Justice and use of power that doesn't create new oppressors. And we've heard that may not be such a big feature here. Hope, a practical hope for the world in the face of evil and death. An enhancement of the fleeting senses of beauty, spirituality, or fullness. A way to make sense. Again, this is closer to the Logos idea. People are looking for a way of explaining the world. Who you are, what human nature is, what human history is. Happiness, as we touched on, that's not based on changing circumstances. And therefore that's not, as we've heard a number of times, based on wealth. Because wealth can be lost. And wealth has to be gained. And wealth has to be, as we heard our brother say earlier, slaved for. But actually, so if that's where our happiness is rooted, it's far too contingent. Because it can get destroyed by a stock market crash or a loss of work or, whatever it might be that takes place. Some sort of international crisis takes place, and as a result, we all lose lots of wealth and therefore lose lots of happiness. Ultimately, that's not existentially satisfying because it's too contingent. Freedom, a freedom that doesn't erode love and community. There was a fascinating... Someone took a picture and posted it on Twitter recently of... They'd been just walking through a city in Britain, and they'd seen a billboard that said, community that's about you. And they were like, that's not a thing. Like that's by definition that's impossible. That's the opposite of what that word means. But because what people want is they want freedom and community, and they don't realize that there's a tension between those things. They don't realize that for you to be in community means a sacrifice of some personal autonomy. That's what it means to be a community. But I haven't really thought about it. So they kind of community that's about you. You think, oh no, there's gobbledygook. And so actually what you need is a freedom that doesn't take away community, because that freedom is in an appropriate way, is actually constrained. What freedom, you're more free than you ever realized in this sense, but that means a cost of actually some freedom in that sense of doing whatever you want. And meaning, a meaning in life that can face any suffering. So suffering is the backdrop to a lot of these, actually. So I'm personally a big fan of the problem of evil, because it makes preaching much easier, because people know that there is a problem. And the hardest people to preach to are people who feel, I just don't need anything. It's only when people are actually asking the question, what can I do about this pain or this evil or this death or this sin that has damaged me in these ways, then people are They might have lots of other pastoral challenges, but they're intellectually, ethically, and emotionally ready to hear the good news of Jesus. And so those are a number of different things that can help. I'm going to pause there. We're going to take a sort of 7 or 8 minute little meander, wander around, loo break, drink something. Is that okay? And then we'll start just after 10, and I'm going to go then to Paul's letter to the Corinthians. We're going to look at that and talk about how Paul does this. Is that okay? So let's take a sort of 8 to 10 minute break. I'm going to try and start again, I think. So if we could find a seat, that would be great. Mainly knowing that we've got to finish at 11, I thought let's use the time best we can. So I will move on. Next page. Here we go. I'm just going to start talking, and those of you who are listening will be right. Shh. Simon Murphy, looking at you. So I want to talk a little bit about 1 Corinthians, which is my, probably the letter I've given the most time to. But I think it is also maybe the best example of Paul. Really, I mean, obviously it's not a sermon, but I think it's the most wonderful example of how to preach and disciple at the same time in the context of. Secular is the wrong word. The ancient world was not secular at all. It certainly wasn't post-Christian. It was pre-Christian. But I think Corinth is a brilliant example of as probably many of us have made this point in our own preaching on the letter, it's a very pagan city. It's full of idols and sexual immorality. And a particularly interesting thing about Corinth is that it's a city where the barriers between the church and the world are very weak. And I was really helped with them. Some of you may have read John Barclay, I don't know, the sort of New Testament scholar. He's very helpful on the difference between Corinth and Thessalonica. That in Thessalonica you have the barrier between the church and the world is very high, and as a result the problem is persecution, and the church almost needs to be reminded to be kind of normal in the world and mind their own business and get on with their work and not be lazy. Whereas in Corinth the opposite happens, where the barrier between the church and the world is too low, and the barrier is too porous. People are jumping in and out of the church and the world, which is great in the sense that it means unbelievers are in your meetings, so you have to think carefully about how he says, prophecy and tongues, all those things, it's all because you've got unbelievers here, and you're in business with them, and you're getting married to them, and it's bad because the barriers are not high enough because you're getting polluted, and you've got people sleeping with their stepmothers, and you've got people, you're eating in their idol temples and all that. That's the dynamic in Corinth. And so Paul's emphases in this letter are very helpful for preachers in post-Christendom, like where I am, and in any kind of secular city today. And partly that's on the level of content, and partly it's on the level of form, which is what I want to major on. On the level of content, what Paul does is he bookends all the sticky subjects he's going to talk about, and they are all the big ones, really, but he bookends them between the cross at the start and the resurrection at the end, which is not an accident, I think. And in principle, Paul, it doesn't look very structured. If you read the letter, Paul is continuing, now, for the matters you wrote about. And then he just talks for a few chapters and then goes, now, about, and then goes off about something else. But when you look at it more carefully, you realize what he's doing is he's sandwiching bookend. This is the filling, but the sandwich is here and here. And so he's then going suffering, sex, idolatry, contextualization and the gospel, the sacraments, the spirit, and then love. But he's putting all of that content in between cross and resurrection. And that is obviously, as preachers, is gold dust. You just say, I'm not saying that's a model for every message. You start with the cross, then do the thing you're talking about. And then I'm not saying that. That would be very repetitive and probably not very fruitful. But these big subjects, and these are some of the biggest ones that I face as a pastor, probably that you do as well, to teach on. You think he's always framing that within the foolishness of the cross and the triumph of the resurrection. So it's very helpful at a level of content. But the thing I particularly want to draw attention to as we talk for a bit, and I'll teach through this for I don't know, 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll do questions and see where that goes. But I really find helpful about Corinthians is Paul's approach to the letter when it comes to form, in the manner in which he addresses cultural issues and the manner in which he models for us how to engage in preaching and discipleship at the same time when it comes to difficult discipleship issues in a pagan world. So the issues have changed, and I expect the issues in Singapore and London are different, but probably the issues in Singapore and London have a lot more in common than either of us do with the issues in Corinth. I imagine the manner of eating in idols temples would be an obvious example, where you've got 3 chapters in this letter talking about an issue which barely arises in contemporary London, and probably not much in Singapore, maybe in certain settings, I don't know. And here's some of the things that he does, and I just want to touch on them, and then we've got a couple of other pages to look at. One of the things that I find is most helpful, how many people have come across the word or the concept of counter-catechesis, that word is familiar? One or two, a handful. Okay, so because I think this is really good. The idea that what Paul does over and over again is counter-catechesis. That is, he's catechizing people. He's saying these are the things you must believe, and you need to almost learn that these are the things you must believe. But he's deliberately doing them in dialogue with slogans or things that pass for wisdom in the Corinthian culture. And it also there are two good reasons for this word. I got it from Alan Jacobs, the American literary professor, actually. But the idea that counter-catechesis, firstly, the idea of, this is the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it was said, but I say to you. You have heard, and Jesus does it 6 times in the most famous sermon ever preached. It's a good model. You've heard this, but this is what I'm telling you. And learning how to preach by observing what passes for wisdom in your culture and then countering it in catechesis. The second benefit is it enables you to use the adjective counter-catechetical, which is just the best word in any language that I've heard. Counter-catechetical. It's just lovely. And you get points just for using it. People think, oh, they must know what they're talking about. So I do this, and I made reference to it earlier when I was sitting in the coffee shop where I do a lot of my writing in my hometown, and this, to be honest, very visibly lesbian woman comes in. She's all the stereotypes of, is very obviously lesbian. She walks in, and on the back of her legs got "Love means love" tattooed. And I was like, that's a good example of a slogan that passes for wisdom in my culture, where, I mean, obviously it means nothing at all. Love means love, by definition, is true. But what I mean is that phrase embodies a very powerful cultural narrative. And it's just good to go, right, that's what passes for wisdom. So how would I say, you have heard it was said, love means love, but I say to you, now, obviously in that particular case, you have to grant that it is true on the face of it, but what it really means is you can have sex with whoever you want, it doesn't matter, and then say, how would you respond? So Paul does that a lot in this letter. Here's a few examples. Everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. He is counter-catechizing. He's saying, you all know this is true, and in many translations they will do these in quotes so that you can see where the slogan is and where the response is. Food for the body and the body for food, and God will destroy them both. But the body's not meant for immorality, but for the Lord. So he's regularly counter-catechizing, saying, this is something that you guys are all saying. In other words, as you know, if you preach through this letter, sex is just like food. It is a bodily need people have. It exists because bodies are there. And as long as we have bodies, we're going to need food and we're going to need sex. So if you're a male and you've got influence in Corinth and you want to have sex with someone, you can just do that like you have a meal. It's just a bodily need you have. What's the problem? And in some ways, the woman, the slave girl, whoever it is with whom you are having these sexual relations is really like a meal for you. It's just a bodily function. What's the problem? So yes, but the body's not meant for immorality, but for the Lord. The body is designed in a certain way by its maker. And the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, as we'll see later on in that section. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Okay, but since there is so much sexual immorality, notice here, if you preach through 1 Corinthians 6 and 7, you'll know this, that Paul is responding to two opposite objections. People who say you can have sex with whoever you want, and people say you shouldn't be having sex at all. And Paul is counter-catechizing in two directions, and you have to do that too. I'm sure I wouldn't know what all the issues are. I certainly do. There are some people in our city who would be at risk of a distortion in that direction and others in the other. Now, in my city, it's not about sex. There's no one in my city arguing this. Yeah? No, in fact, that really doesn't pass for wisdom in London, but there are lots of instances where you've got some people pulling you too far. Their danger is drifting from Christianity that way and others that way, and you have to counter-catechize both, and Paul does, and he does them consecutively. So chapter 6, 12 to 20 is pushing against the people who are having sex with prostitutes. Chapter 7 is pushing against people whose view of sex is ascetic. It's like deny yourself sex, or some of them are. But since there's so much sexual morality, each man should have his own wife, each woman her own husband. Well, we all possess knowledge. Yeah, but knowledge puffs up, love builds up. You've heard it was said, I'm saying to you. We know an idol is nothing at all, and there's no God but one. Yeah, but not everyone possesses this knowledge, so when you eat in an idol temple, it brings destruction on these people. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything's helpful. No one should seek their own good but the good of others. How are the dead raised? What kind of body? You fools, what you sow doesn't come to life till it dies. You notice he's continually quoting things that they believe and then responding. And to me, I mean, this is... I often, in our context, I find post-Christianity makes preaching easier, not harder, because it actually enables me to continually join. The people in the church are increasingly asking the same questions as the world, because people in the church have these same not these ones, but they have the same kinds of what passes for wisdom in their culture seeps into their lives as well. They're asking it. Their kids are asking them. So they're continually having to, and they will quote, they'll parrot things. Yeah, but you've got to be true to yourself. Yeah, but everything happens for a reason. Yeah, but, they will say the things that in my city are just said, they're like Disney ideas or bumper stickers, but people in the church believe them. So you're going, which ones of those might the text I'm preaching today challenge or illuminate or bring clarity to? Now, obviously, in my case, I don't literally do, you have heard it was said, but I'm said, but I will just be aware in this text, I mean, you can think it through. Well, like, what are you preaching this next Sunday? And where you might be doing this already. Many of us probably intuitively do this without thinking. But when you think about your text for Sunday, where does this passage challenge something that passes for wisdom in my culture? So where does the something about this passage, because it will definitely do it in multiple places, there'll be something in this text that subverts, challenges, clarifies, reframes something that everybody in Singapore takes for granted. And I can now use this to challenge that in this kind of fashion, however I articulate that. And we could talk about that in the context of the questions and so on, if it's helpful. But I realised when I was, with my own messages, I just think, I preached on technology 3 days ago. We're doing a new series on it, or 4 days ago. And I was just thinking there are lots of opportunities here to take something that everybody thinks this is just normal wisdom, including in the church, and I want to use this passage to challenge those kind of assumptions to help people think about what they're doing. So, counter-catechetical. It's a good word, if you remember nothing else. Okay. So, the second thing that Paul does in terms of form is he does... Now, this is my friend Chris Watkin talks about... Have anybody come across his book, Biblical Critical Theory? There's lots of nodding. Okay. So Chris uses the word diagonalization for it, which I love as a word, but you might not like that word, but I think the principle of it is really, really valuable anyway, which is finding the radical alternative that challenges both camps on an issue. And Chris talks about diagonalization. I'll show you, again, I sort of just in the form of a graphic. Again, Steve, there's a shape. If there isn't a shape, it's not true. But this will be, he does it in the sense that we've just alluded to this example with sex, where you have some people who say men can have sex with whoever they like, and others who say men shouldn't have sex at all. And what Paul does is he diagonalizes with the teaching of 1 Corinthians 7, where he says there is a radical alternative that debunks that and presents something better. Now, the reason why Chris uses the word diagonalization, and I think it can be helpful to think of something like that isn't in the middle, right? Because the danger is that people go, well, actually what we're trying to do is find something that's in the middle of the two secular extremes. And that is a bad idea, mainly because if the secular extremes move, then the gospel teaching has to move as well. So if you are in a culture, because not every issue, the truth is found in the middle. In fact, very few issues is the truth found in the middle. The truth, when it comes to sort of, it's to be honest, it's left-right thinking. It's a sort of political framing that what you have is a left-wing extreme. The state owns everything, and a right-wing extreme, the state owns nothing, and then the centre view is to say the state has power for certain things. It's like a sort of political framing, so let's be centrists. Well, that might work on some issues, but most of the time it doesn't, and what otherwise happens is the culture, say, on sex, moves dramatically, as in my country it has in the last 50 years, and the church has to keep moving to try and, where's the middle between these two extremes? And you end up absolutely... Whereas actually, the sexual ethic that the Bible teaches is much, much closer to one end of what people might believe than it is at the other. We don't sit in the centre. So what we have to do instead is to what Chris calls diagonalising, which is to try and find the radical alternative that challenges both. Now, Paul does this over and over again in this letter. These are just two examples. Idols are real and there are many gods is one view. Idols are nothing, so idol feasts don't matter is another view. And Paul, again, he doesn't sit in the middle. He subverts them both with a vision of, no, idols are not real in and of themselves, but they exercise spiritual power over people who believe in them. And because they do, if you act as if idols are nothing and therefore just go to any idol temple you will destroy the faith of your brother for whom Christ died, because they won't know what you claim to know, which is that idols don't exist. Which is a subtle, nuanced take on, but is a way of diagonalizing both of these positions. He does it again on spiritual gifts. He said, some people say, tongues are everything. Let's speak in tongues all the time. And you've got another group in Corinth saying, this is divisive and a mess. And he says, no. Well, in that case, what you want to do is you're going to allow speaking in tongues, but you don't prioritize it over other gifts. Make sure you prioritize prophecy, particularly because it's a gift that people will understand. And so again, Paul over and over again in this letter will find the radical alternative that challenges both. And there are lots of areas where that's true in a mainstream culture. I think, well, some people believe that, some believe that. There is a radical middle. And Chris's book, Biblical Critical Theory, is a brilliant example of how to do that with loads of theological issues, not just sort of exegetical ones like this, but he does it with the Trinity. At one point, he does it with Brexit, which, when Britain left the EU, found a way of using Scripture to diagonalize Brexit, which I found very funny and thought was really, really smart. So this is another thing that Paul does. Those are just two examples, but if you look for this approach in 1 Corinthians, you'll notice he does it over and over again. It's really helpful. So that's a second when it comes to form. So counter-catechesis, diagonalization is a really good tool. And Paul also uses the church as apologetic, which, as in the church is the argument for the thing he's saying, which in many ways is addressing this issue, the issue of credibility. What Paul is drawing on is the very existence of the Corinthian church lends credibility to the message that he is preaching to them. And this is that famous passage which is, rightly lauded, isn't it? Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you. It's wonderful. The apologetic I've got is you guys were really stupid. That's basically what he says, isn't it? But think of what you were. You guys are acting as if human leaders, this is the issue he's facing, human leaders are you should divide along human lines and honor their eloquence and their worldly wisdom, and you're acting as if that is somehow a right way of forming allegiances in Christ. But you ought to know that is the silliest thing in the world to do, because if you look at yourselves, you'll realize that God didn't call you because you were wise or noble or wealthy or whatever, because God chose the foolish things of the world, namely you, to shame the wise, and the weak things to shame the strong, that no one may boast in his presence. And so Paul uses the existence of the church as an apologetic to reassure the church of Christian doctrine. And that is a very powerful idea. And you might think, well, in that particular instance, okay, that works. I'm not sure how that would work with the issue I'm preaching on Sunday. And it might not always, by the way. Not all of these things will help in every message. But as a tool to say the very existence of this community provides evidence for the fact that what Scripture is saying here is true. It's surprising how often that does work. Surprising how often the very reality of the church's existence verifies the teaching of the passage you're preaching to those people. You can see it here. I mean, one example we often use in our church because of our setting is of diversity, where you just say, if you look, we regularly do it, look around this room. In what other setting in our nation does a group like this exist? Maybe a major sports event. But even then, there's not diversity in certain ways. Actually, and we know, but socioeconomically, research has done that the church is the most diverse gathering of people in our nation when it comes to issues, when it comes to race and when it comes to age. I think it's less diverse than a football match in one category, but in almost every other, it's the place where these people come together. So the very existence of the church demonstrates or verifies this kind of teaching that the passage is bringing. And so that is, again, something that Paul enjoys leaning into when he can. Is that me? It is. How bizarre is that? It's just started playing Brian Dirksen on my phone. I don't know why. It's a good song, but I didn't want it now. So counter-catechesis, diagonalization, the church is apologetic, and then, of course, in 1 Corinthians, a relentless emphasis on grace, which I just think, again, we would, I hope, God willing, always bring emphasis on grace in our preaching and teaching. But what's powerful for me in 1 Corinthians is how often Paul uses it when you might not otherwise expect him to. Because he doesn't just do it as grace as opposed to works. In fact, in Corinthians, he's not particularly bothered about that I mean, he still believes it, but it's not Romans, it's not Galatians. He's not doing a polemic against justification by works in 1 Corinthians. But he talks about grace all the time anyway, because they've got the different issues, different problems. So as he always does, he bookends the letter with grace. So grace comes in the very first and the very last sentence of the letter. But he does it when he's talking to the Corinthians about leadership. So he's not ranting about circumcision here, like he does in Galatians. Instead, he actually brings it in the context of, this was one of Augustine's favourite verses because he felt it was such an expression of the grace of God and the supremacy of grace. What do you have that you didn't receive? And he does that in a polemic about honouring human leaders, which is not the most obvious way. If I said, what doctrine would you want to respond to by preaching grace? Idolising leadership probably wouldn't be the first thing that would come to your mind or mine. But that's what Paul does, because Paul says, hang on, how could you possibly over-venerate me or Apollos or anyone else as if what do you have that you didn't receive? Everything is a gift. Everything's a gift. So why would you venerate the leaders in the way that you are and divide over them? They are just stewards. They're carriers of a gift, and so are you. So what do you have that you didn't receive? And there's grace just the most... obviously such a beautiful, rich teaching, but one in which you can continually point people back to the giver. Say, everything you have is a gift. And similarly, the number of people who've mentioned wealth and the pursuit of wealth, even in this city, as that's one of the great idols. This is grace as the undercutting of the doctrine of the secular prosperity gospel, as in the way to be happy is to have lots of money, or the way to be meaningful in life is to have lots of possessions. What do you have that you didn't receive is a very powerful undercutting of that. And Paul uses it not to oppose works righteousness, but to oppose the idea that you can attain status and value independently of the gift God has given you. He actually does, of course, a lovely... I don't know what's going on there. I'm very sorry about that. That was Is He Worthy? A little. I'm so quite glad it's turned onto that podcast, that playlist. It could have come up with anything, but anyway. One of my favourites is he does a diagonalize. He does this with the doctrine of grace and works in chapter 15 and verse 10, which is one of the New Testament's greatest sentences, I think. By the grace of God, I worked harder than any of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that is with me. So his grace to me wasn't without effect. So grace doesn't lead me to be lazy and passive, but nor does it make me a workaholic. I end up being able to work by the grace that he has given me. And it's a wonderfully diagonalized, confusing sentence in which he basically manages to debunk both of the extremes you might have about grace and works in one sentence, but doing it again in reference to his own apostolic ministry and their belief in the resurrection. So a lot of things, I think, there's the content in 1 Corinthians, sandwich our teaching between cross and resurrection and deal with the big sticky issues, but framed by the essence of the cross, which I trust and the resurrection, which I trust we would, but some methodological means of preaching, whatever the subject, that I think can really help animate our preaching, makes it more interesting, because the people of God are then hearing and go, oh, that really joins the dots between that text and that thing that was in the paper last week, or that thing that's doing the rounds on YouTube, or that thing that my children have just wanted to get tattooed on their whatever, or whatever. That might not be the way it works here, but as in those things that pass for wisdom in this culture, that bumper sticker, and that is just continually connecting so that people can't read the text and go, this has nothing to say to me, or I don't really get why that matters. Because you're regularly drawing out the truth from it to respond to and engage with the way that our secular culture works. So I think that's me done in terms of formal sort of what I wanted to present. But I thought it'd be great to have some time for questions. How do you want to do do we just sort of open this up and say, does anybody have anything they want to ask off? So you can have a minute to think and just sort of consider, okay, what might I like to pick up on here? And we can go wherever we like, really. But there might be some things you want to come back to, return to, things which are unrelated, which might help. But yeah, who wants to go first? Yes, sir. The dodecahedron. Or maybe it's not. I think that might be a three-dimensional shape.
I'm not as good at math as you are. I think this is very helpful. But I was wondering when we overlap this with what you said about pathos, ethos, and logos, and the reconstruct.
Yeah.
But I noticed that you did not talk a lot about deconstruct. So could you just comment on it?
Yes, very helpful. Very helpful, yeah. So some of this is, I think I probably have there is an issue of methodology here for me, which is that generally that it is easier to start with, at least, it's easier to say to people, this is what you want and this is what you believe and here's why you're right, than this is what you believe and here's why you're wrong. Right? It's more winning, it's more engaging. People lean towards it now. Of course, I then have to show all the ways in which what they're currently looking for, say happiness, is not satisfied by the things that they think they will find it in. So there's a lot of deconstruction that has to be done. But the draw, the thing that I'm beginning with is, here is a legitimate desire, and now this is why you won't find it in that, and you only find it in Jesus. Rather than, here's why either the desire is wrong, or starting with, it's very obvious, isn't it, that happiness doesn't come from money. Or happiness doesn't come from this, and then critiquing money. What I actually want to do is say, there is a good desire underneath this, which is happiness. You were created for everlasting joy, at your right hand of pleasures forever. This is the promise of Scripture. That's a good desire. You should have that. You are trying to find it here. That doesn't work because... but ultimately it is found in Jesus. And that is what I think it's a Kellerism, is that apologetics or evangelistic preaching is basically yes, but no, but yes. Have you heard that before? That's what I'm trying to do all the time in preaching. Is like, yes, you have a desire, there's a thing, there's a truth that's expressed. Love is love, kindness is everything. Yes, but no, you are interpreting that to mean you cannot tell someone that what they're doing is morally unacceptable. There's a no. That doesn't follow from this at all. If kindness is everything, that's not really true. But I know what you mean is, this is a really important value. It's really good that we are kind to one another. Yeah, this is one of the fruits of the Spirit. You got it from Christianity. But no, because what you mean by that is, no one is allowed to bring any kind of moral correction to any other human being. And you know perfectly well that's not true, because if this person was a paedophile or a genocidal maniac or whatever, you would never say, oh, well, it just matters to be kind. You are rightly discerning that some things are wrong, and you should speak to them, and the only way to be kind is actually to tell people what they're doing is wrong. But yes, in that the desire for the human beings to be kind to one another is a good desire, and it's found ultimately fulfilled in Christ, and the kindness of Jesus the kindness of God is meant to lead you to repentance. And so you bring exactly that. So the correction. I have, in this page, I'm much of what I've said today, I am majoring on the yes, but I would say that here is the no. If you see what I mean. So the yes, but no. So, or in your terms, the deconstruction, reconstruction. So this is the sort of, I'm affirming it, but this is where the deconstruction happens. And I think they're both, we've got to do them both all the time. But I think generally speaking, it depends on the kind of church background we are, I guess. But generally speaking, I would say, so as soon as people use language like the gospel fellowship or gospel-centered, my assumption is, because that's exactly where I'm from, my assumption is that our kind of the way we learn to preach is generally we are good on, this is what the text says, and it does collide with the world. But that actually sometimes, but look at the ways in which the world might actually be longing for something good is a good thing. So that's why I've done it that way around, but we have to do them both all the time. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Very helpful. It seems like this kind of approach is easier to do if you have like topical preaching. But if you have like an expository series where you're working through text, you want to be driven by the passage and expound it. How do you incorporate some of the tell us practically how that works for you.
That is very interesting. I might be the other way round to that, actually, but I don't know whether I'm agreeing with myself. Sorry, I'm an external processor. I learn as I talk. So fortunately, you don't. This is not how the Bible was written. But when I'm thinking, because I think it helps me more in many ways with expository preaching, because the question, it makes me ask the question: where does this text collide with what passes for wisdom in our culture, in a way that topical sermons, I've actually selected the topic for the very need to try and help the church understand an issue. Whereas when I'm doing an expository series and we're just the next one we're doing is on the book of Daniel or whatever, I find myself going, okay, this book is going to somewhere, this text, So, do you know, Trevin Wax, I don't know if that name means anything to any of you, but Trevin has this wrote a lovely article recently on finding the edge in preaching, where he said, I can't do this with him, where he says that with every text there is a point, like where the rubber hits the road. There is an edge between the text and the world, and you have to find where that edge is. And if you don't find it, your preaching's boring, and he said he gives the example of preaching on the Lord's Prayer and going. Everyone had written this sermon, and it was half an hour, 40 minutes, and it was all true. And it was just really boring. And I didn't know why. I was like, everything in this, everyone has heard this many times before. And unless you'd literally never heard the Lord's Prayer, which is unlikely, you wouldn't find anything interesting in it, even though it's true. And then he went, well, the reason is because I haven't found where does the Lord's Prayer collide with what everybody in my culture assumes to be true on fatherhood, on whose name is to be hallowed, on what kingdom we're looking for and when it comes about, on how we are provided for in daily bread and all that sort of thing. And I think that sort of, to me, that's where this works as a really helpful tool, because it makes me think I am now preaching on. I mean, what was your most recent sermon? Luke 8, 1 to 15. So you're reading through and go, where does this? It just raises that question. So where does this challenge or collide with what people in my city believe? Where might this diagonalize? Might sit in between two extremes that both need to be subverted? Where might it rebuke or provoke? Where might desires that people have in my culture, which are themselves good but have been satisfied in the wrong ways, might be satisfied if they had this? Whereas if it's topical, I've probably chosen it for the very reason that it fits some of those criteria already. So I actually find it more helpful, maybe, as a tool. As I say, I don't do all of them all the time. And Stephen did hear a lot of my preaching, so they know you don't do all of those things every week. But these are way. And Paul, actually, even I've said it in 1 Corinthians, doesn't do that either, because there are some sections of the letter where he does a lot of counter-catechesis on sex, for instance, but he might not do. So the church is apologetic. It's actually the church is a terrible apologetic on sex. Like, he has to say, even the pagans don't do this. So there are some of these tools that will work better for some issues than others, but I find they're just another tool in the toolbox which can help us. Yes, sir.
How do we manage the tension between science-based work versus postmodernism, which is very emotional? Yeah, so how do we balance these two? We want to look at facts, but yet there's no absolute truth.
Very good.
Tension is how do you manage that?
Very good.
The heart and then the mind.
Yes. So this is where, so for me, Pascal's other triangle is probably the heart of what I try and do there. I don't know one in my city actually believes that there's no such thing as truth on particular issues. They might believe what they mean by that statement. If they make that statement, and a lot of them wouldn't, but if they make that statement, what they mean is I haven't yet found an all-encompassing worldview that ticks every box and that works for everything. What I have is my own little self-constructed set of beliefs, but I believe that those things in themselves are true. And if someone was to say to me, so do you think it's acceptable to kill people because they're from another ethnic group than you, they would say, no, that is absolutely wrong. So they don't believe that there's no such thing as truth in that sense. So I don't think they are as postmodern as they think they are. But this is where this helps, because with the modern, we are basically products, at least in my city and probably yours by the sounds of that question, are products of both of those impulses together. That we actually go, well, actually, there's a lot about our scientific technology that is obvious. You can test it, you can replicate it. That's obviously a good form of knowledge, but there's also a lot about the modern world that doesn't provide the deep existential answers I need, and that's where I start leaning into more areas of emotion and even of, does it work? Forget whether it's true or not. Do I feel better at the end of it? And so because I'm doing all three of these things, it doesn't feel like a tension. It feels like more different areas I'm trying to address in the same kind of message about it. So I'm almost aware as I'm writing, preaching through Luke 8, 1 to 15, thinking there's probably something in here that is intellectually satisfying, and there's also something in here that's emotionally, existentially satisfying, and something that will make life work better as well. There's probably elements of all of those in most texts, and at least one or two of them. So I can draw those out as I go, and then hopefully I've got something for both the person who's very led by them, I just follow your heart, and the person who's like, no, but this is This is absolutely nonsense. I hate people who follow their heart. That's obviously untrue. And you've probably got both in the room, and you can address both. So again, that to me is another benefit of the toolkit. What I like, as I've read some interesting stuff recently on metamodernism, the idea that what you have in art in the last 10 years is you're beginning to get a synthesis between the modern and the postmodern forming, where you get lots and lots of stories. So, I don't know, a great example that I saw recently was the Barbie movie, which probably is not the most popular movie here. I don't know. It was on the plane and I came over, but I saw it a few months ago. But it's really like a really interesting example of something that in some ways that has quite a sort of modernist, it sort of messes with genres. Lots of art now is messing with genres and is deliberately uses quite postmodern methods, but actually to try and get a resolution and a sense of this does land in a way that is itself quite modernist. And so rather than going, there's loads of different takes on truth and we don't know what to do about it, or this is a very linear story, it begins with beginning, middle, end. You have lots of stories that use postmodern methods. So Christopher Nolan, and the sort of multilinear, non-linear narrative, that sort of thing. Lots of sort of methods that are themselves very postmodern. Lots of cuts and lots of angles and lots of destabilizing, but actually still brings a sense of no, there is a nice resolution at the end, even though the resolution itself is a little surreal and we're not quite sure why, which Barbie world is it? I mean, leaves us asking questions, but it kind of all lands nicely. Because, and sorry, I mean, they may not be the best reference points to use here, but I think that sense that what actually is already happening in the arts is an attempt to try and reconcile those two modernist and postmodernist impulses. And I think as a preacher, I do that by speaking to both the heart and the head whenever I preach. And that's I think, the best way of trying to do it. Are there questions or comments? Yes, Dan.
Talking about counter catechesis, you are challenging a certain form of wisdom. But how do you know in terms of like your people? Because I mean, it sounds like your church is very diverse, right? So what may be true for one, what may not be true for another. Like as a preacher, you try to be very broad in what you are like addressing, or
very good. That's a really good question, and I do think it probably makes it harder. The more diverse your church is, the more. So what I probably found is that my first year or two when I came to King's, I just had to learn a lot about things that I didn't. So I lived in a town called Eastbourne, which is nearly everybody's. It's like a white middle class town. And I moved to a very black area in South East London, and early on realised, wow, my first week I preached an apologetics message and none of the questions I got, and we had Q&A at the end actually, and then people come up afterwards, I didn't get a single question about sexual ethics, which is all that people in my hometown would have talked about. And the first week I get a question about slavery, which was nothing to do with what I'd said, and I realised. And it was a real kind of, that we're not in Kansas anymore kind of thing. And I had to just spend a lot of time trying to learn, like, what are the, and you're right, we do. And so we've got some really good examples of that. Actually, I would say on sexual ethics in the church in London, we have exactly that. And I do have to diagonalise, because in our church we found we've got some people who are much more secular influenced and would be, they're certainly not, no one is saying that. But what we have is people can have sex with whoever they want. But we've also got some people who say homosexuality is like, that is the thing we don't even speak about. That is not an issue. No Christians have ever struggled with temptation to people who say we mustn't even go there. And we mustn't use that language. And actually, and almost had to diagonalise a bit and go, there are issues here. And this is one of many sins that Paul talks about, but it's not actually in a completely different category to all the others we have. So I actually had to, in some ways, go, we have to diagonalise, have to push that way and that way in the same message. And at times I've done that well, and at other times I've not done it well. But I think that to me has been probably quite a helpful example where diagonalisation is important, because you've got, not just in the culture, but even in the church, might have quite different takes on the same issue. And so you have to say, this is neither of those. Obviously, this idea is a very Kellerish idea, and he had it because he'd got people who would be people move into Manhattan from very rural, much more sort of, I've come to the city to make money and I'm a banker and I'm actually quite right-wing. I've also got some people who are very progressive-y blue state Americans who are really very left-wing, and I've got to try and find a way of showing them why neither of those are. And in Britain, that's probably not the dynamic we have in the same way. But I think that you're always going to have in any church. You have different spectrums, and you have to. That's why diagnosation is helpful, I think. Any others? Okay. What do you want to do? Keep going, all right? Taking a while to warm up, Simon says. Okay. Yes, sir.
This idea of diagonalization. Is that what Keller refers to the third way?
Yeah, so I think lots of people took the idea of so the third way was a political thing originally, right? It was maybe that goes back further than this, but it was a sort of 1990s Bill Clinton and Tony Blair in the Anglosphere anyway. The third way was there is a way of being sort of conservative on, kind of law and order and borders, and being progressive on reforms and economics and that sort of thing, and then got adapted into the church. And so I think one of the reasons why there's lots of people in North America who I think for terrible reasons, but who hate Keller and hate third wayism and it's all like, this is awful, right? Winsomeness, why would? And if you're into the very online space, and you'd probably come across a lot of that. And the reason why they get annoyed about it is because they think that what he's doing is always he's doing what Bill Clinton did, which is like triangulating and going, well, there's one there and there's one there, and if we want to win, well, you need to be in the middle. And so continually calibrating, and then as culture drifts, as Americans would see it, further and further into the left, then the church has to move further and further left as well to keep balancing. That's the critique. If that's what, I don't think, I personally have listened to a lot of Keller's preaching, I've read a lot of his books, and I don't think that's remotely what he is doing, but that's how he has been represented. So third wayism I think would be a bad word, at least with people who, in the Anglosphere and people who know what that language would mean. I wouldn't use that term, but I think that is probably the same thing that you're referring to. I just think that's why Chris uses the language of diagonalization. And Dan Strange is another guy who's done a lot on this, and he calls it subversive fulfillment, but he's done the same thing, that there's basically there's a subversive way of fulfilling both the things that are true of both of them, but they both get critiqued. But it's an alternative that challenges both, not an alternative that splits the difference. That's a better way of saying it. Yes.
How do you think about the interaction between so-called in 1 Corinthians, the not speaking in words of eloquent wisdom, like the gospel, and like kind of everything that you're saying about being persuasive?
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So Paul, I think there is a very knowing irony in Paul's thing about words of persuasive wisdom. So a lot of commentators notice, like, there is probably no more rhetorically impressive passages in the entire maybe arguably in the entire Bible, a couple of possible exceptions, but certainly in New Testament letters, than Paul comes up with in 1 Corinthians 4 and in 2 Corinthians 6. The famous, as dying and behold we live, as having nothing yet possessing it. It's just the most incredibly rhetorical plan, but people would study it for thousands of years and do, as a kind of, what a way of, we have become and are still like the scum of the earth, the refuse of all these incredible rhetoric. And yet he's saying it in a letter in which he's debunking the power of wise and persuasive words. And I don't think he's not doing that unthinkingly. I think because he's saying it's not that I don't think you should use... I don't think Paul would say, if you were asking him, no, you mustn't use anything to sound as persuasive and as compelling as you can. I think he'd say, you just can't base people's faith on those things. People's faith has got to rest on the foolishness of the cross, and if it doesn't, it won't last, because someone else will come along and say something more rhetorically impressive that is... And they'll watch modern days, they'll watch a political ad, or they'll watch a music video that makes the case for gay marriage that is so convincing. You think, well, that's so emotionally moving. How could I possibly not follow it? If you build people's faith on wise and persuasive words, someone else will have wise and persuasive words that will lead them into falsehood, and they've got nothing. So you've got to build on the foundation of the cross. But I don't think that he would say, therefore, don't make any effort to make your preaching compelling or persuasive, because he himself clearly does that in a dramatic way. I mean, he's like one of the master resurrections in the history of the human race. And that's one of the reasons his ideas are still being talked about now. And Jesus, similarly, you can't go through, like, is there a more perfect story ever told in the history of humanity than the story of the lost sons? You can't improve on it as a mean of communication. And you could, and people do, and study it and say this is the law of threes, it's the pathos, it's the setting up the story and then introducing another character who subverts the expectation of the first one. It's in so many ways a perfect piece of storytelling. And obviously we are not meant to learn from that. Don't tell compelling stories. We're meant to learn, don't build people's faith on a compelling story or a rhetorically impressive flourish or whatever, because then if someone comes up with a better one, their faith will be built on your words and it won't work. You have to build, the foundation must be the cross. But there is lots of scope, I think, and you see lots of it in the letter. I'm trying to, I guess, show that. There's lots of all three of these in Paul and Jesus and everybody else. I expect there are people for whom there is a danger of doing it so well that people become persuaded by the skill. There's I don't know if it's true. It's one of those stories that gets told. But the guy who goes to listen to two preachers in London, it sounds a bit too good to be true. But there's a story told in London anyway of a guy, someone who goes and listens to two great preachers of the day. And there's this sort of two very famous preachers. Another guy whose name I forget, and Spurgeon, and comes out of the first one and goes, "What a magnificent preacher is Mr. So-and-so," and comes out of the second one and goes, "What a magnificent Saviour is Jesus Christ." Now, I don't know if it's a true story. If it is, I've disparaged it and I feel bad. It sounds a bit too good to be true. But that idea that you really don't want people going, "What a compelling message." You want, "What a magnificent Saviour." And there probably is a danger of doing that too well. But I would think for most of us, it's just a skill to pursue and to get really good at, because you want people to remember what they're being told. You want them to understand it. But yeah, if people's faith is built on your preaching, that's the concern. Yeah, it's a really good challenge, actually. But I do think Paul himself undermines it in a way by the way he writes this very letter. It's incredibly compelling. Yeah.
How does preaching of traditional apologetic topics change in our era?
What would you mean by a traditional apologetic topic there?
Suffering,
Yeah.
resurrection.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I think. So I suppose I've never, I've never preached in a modernist context in the sense that I suppose the world as I've been. I'm not really. I don't really buy postmodernism. That came across in my earlier answer to your question. So in a way, I think it's part of the dialectic within modernism rather than a new thing entirely. But I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. But so I've never grown up in a context where I'm 46, but I'm probably too young to have felt that change. I've always been in a culture where there is a very strong cultural narrative that looks roughly like that is kind of a fusion of what I think you're calling modernist and postmodernist ideas. So I haven't ever had to preach through that change. But here's the way, with suffering, I think is a great example of giving what might sound like quite a postmodern answer, I think in the terms you're using that word, which is that when I preach on suffering, I would say, ultimately the answer to the question, why does God allow suffering, is, I don't know. That's what I do. I say, here's lots of answers people give because it helps people to grow in godliness. Okay, because the fall happened, because there is going to be a greater good. There comes a greater good defence, the free will defence. All of these, I will allude to all of those and say, I won't use the jargon, but I say, here's the different ways people answer that question. But ultimately, none of those satisfy. For these reasons. This one doesn't work because in that situation it's not the case. This one doesn't work because it puts the blame on the person. This one doesn't work because people don't believe the Garden of Eden story. If they're not Christians, it doesn't help them. And all the way down. Ultimately, the answer is, I don't know. And now here's why I actually think there's a better, more satisfying answer. What I do know is that it's not because God isn't good and he doesn't love me. And that's how now that probably sounds like quite a postmodern, I think, in the way you're using it, rather than a modernist answer. I don't go, here's the free will defence and how it works and why it's satisfying. But I personally am, as I say, I'm not old enough to have. I've only started preaching when I was in my 20s. So I've probably been preaching for 20 years, but I haven't had to migrate on that. And I find but it often is a more satisfying way of answering a question. And what I really try and then spend my time doing is, here is why, if there was a good God, why we wouldn't necessarily expect to know why all suffering was allowed. Sometimes it might be because of this. And you've got examples like that in your life. Sometimes it's because of bad decisions you made. Here's an example. Sometimes it's because the world is broken. There's all sorts of different truths to those answers, but ultimately I don't know why you're experiencing what you are, and that's okay. And here's why I think that's a better, more satisfying answer. So in that sense, I'm probably more I think in your terms, more at the postmodern end. But as I say, I don't tend to use that language because I think the story that people are telling in my context is actually still pretty linear. It covers most things. People don't live with cognitive dissonance most of the time in my city. There are some areas where it doesn't quite work for them, but by and large, they're pretty convinced of what they think. So I tend to use that. Yeah. Yes, and what I'm probably saying to you is I've never done that, but that's just because I've grown up in a setting where that probably isn't how people thought in the first place. I think if I was older, because it just reflects where Britain is, and what I find. So if I compare it when I go to North America, I find that culturally on issues like this, America is they would say to me, we are basically a couple of decades behind what's happened in Europe, as in the de-Christianization of our culture that's happening now happened to you in my childhood, in the sort of 70s or 80s. So we are catching up, and in that sense, I've probably just this has been native to me my whole life, but that wouldn't be true in every country, because countries are experiencing that kind of change at different rates. So that I don't know whether that helps. Did you have a question as well, sir? Okay, no.
No, I was thinking about your comment about not coming to revise specific words. And I was wondering whether there's another kind of diagonalization that Paul does on that as well. Because on one hand, you have this rhetoric form that the Corinthian church is very fond of, referring to why specific words.
Yeah.
And I guess that in the other extreme, there could be, I don't know, caricature of Jonathan Edwards just simply reading off the manuscript.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So you're diagonalizing how compelling your preaching is.
But there seems to be that sense that Paul talks about also presenting Christ with all wisdom in Colossians.
Yeah.
And so in the sense that it's actually that both of the extremes, or whether it's the wise emphasis towards the chauvinist or the non-chauvinist, are actually both fixated on form. But what Paul is saying that the real power is that we try to present Christ as well as we can with all wisdom.
Yeah.
And so that no faith will not actually rest on men.
Very good. So actually the foolishness of the cross is more about the content than it is about the form. So it's not saying preach a rambly sermon on the cross as a way. He's saying no, in some ways be as rhetorically arresting as you can be, but make sure that the content of it is irreducibly the foolishness of the cross rather than the wisdom of the world. I think that's very well said. Yeah, and that chapter, of course, ironically does, of course, exactly that thing, doesn't it? So, yeah, I mean, it is hilarious. It's like I had to read Thomas Hobbes when I was at university, Leviathan, and he has this sort of wonderful thing of like, rhetoric shall not, and I say again, shall not be used. You're like, what? It's just so ridiculous, and I assume he knows he's doing it. But it is, it's a little bit, I think, with Paul, almost like that. I think that's a very helpful third way to use your term. That's very helpful. Yes.
Thanks, Andrew. Given that we're trying to reach a post-Christian, secular, skeptical audience, and part of preaching is trying to work out how the people that I'm speaking to are similar to the people that are being addressed in the scriptures.
Yes.
Do you think there are certain books of the Bible that lend itself to sort of reaching this kind of audience?
Yeah, very good. That's a great question. I mean, I think there are, and I think the challenge is that I think in some ways they're some of the harder ones. So, I mean, let's say the most obvious example to me that really does feel like gosh, this could have been written. This feels like it could have been written 5 years ago rather than 3,000 years ago, is Ecclesiastes. The problem is Ecclesiastes is just if it's not the hardest book, it's very nearly the hardest book to preach on because it talk about, man, in the terms you were using, what sounds postmodern, and obviously this is the thing, is it's not remotely, but in terms of its subversion of it just doesn't resolve like you want it to. Even the very end, you go, have we landed here, or is that you know what I mean? He just that astounding paragraph where it's just like, remember your creation in the days of you. That's probably the most beautiful passage of poetry. I read recently, someone said that Ecclesiastes 12, 1-7 is the most beautiful passage of poetry written in any language for the next 2,500 years. It's not really until you get to John Donne and William Shakespeare, or maybe Dante, but you don't get anyone writing poetry that beautiful anywhere. He was the claim being made, like that. And then at the end of it goes, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. You think, oh no, I really thought we'd landed. And it's like, And so I think they can often be really hard. That to me in the Old Testament is the one that's the most kind of suitable for that. In many ways, it works. It does, because it's difficult and subversive. It does work really well with graduates. I think Ecclesiastes is a great book to. Well, we've never done a series on it. I'm going to preach on it actually in a couple of weeks' time, but it's the first time. I think it'll only be the second sermon on the book of Ecclesiastes that we've done at King's in the 9 years I've been there. Because in our setting is not very, it's city, but it's not high intellectual graduate-y. But I expect people who do sermon series in university cities would lean more into a book like that. I think 1 Corinthians, I've not just chosen it for the form. I do think it's incredibly relevant to expository preaching in a setting like that. But that's not because of its intellectual sort of, it's not like Ecclesiastes in that sense. It's more because the ethical and cultural issues it deals with, idols and sexual immorality, are so compelling. So I think that's a really good example. I think the point, I think it's a well-made point that you have to know your context well enough to go, this book will go down really well with these people. And not only to do that, of course, you must preach the whole counsel of God, but there are times we found where like Revelation as a book just landed with our church. A lot of Africans in our church had a strong belief in spiritual power, which it felt like it equipped people in a way that in my much more white church before, people had heard it, but they'd get their timelines out and they'd start getting nerding out on, how does this fit with it? Whereas actually the Africans were just like, oh yeah, this is exactly, just peeling back the veil and seeing this is the spiritual realities behind these worldly things you can see, really landed with them. Whereas I say, I think if it was in a much more intellectual context, there'd be other New Testament books, even which gospel you naturally go to. On a scale from Mark to John, I think you sort of go to Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, in terms of how much into ideas and conceptual things are people. You just find some things will just naturally resonate more, but that doesn't mean you don't preach on the others at all. It just means there might be for guest events or things where you're really leaning into evangelism, where you go, this here works really well for this kind of communication. Yeah, Steve.
Issue of money. Which I think seems to be a subject which would connect to both generations.
Yeah.
The boomer generation, like material gain, but also this just being in this city or in our city.
Yeah.
So any comment on how the god of money is such a god that it in a sense is one subject like sexuality maybe.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's very relevant.
Yeah. In every
culture and in every
yes.
generation.
Yeah, that's why it has been very interesting hearing how many of you have mentioned it, because it feels like it's actually a bigger issue here than it is in our city, where it is obviously also a big issue, money. The thing that was fascinating to me hearing your questions was, to what do people want that money gives them? Because money ultimately, you can't serve both God and mammon, right? But mammon, the spiritual power, is compelling because it offers you something that is more than just money. No one actually wants just money. They want money because it gives them X. And to me, feel like three obvious things that people might want money for that are actually you would then address in preaching in a very different way. So I think some people want money because they want status, which I think is where some of the comments you made came. It's almost like a way of showing This is just a status game that human beings play, and in most cultures in history, they haven't had money. There hasn't been enough money to go round for that to be the game, but it is in ours because people have got so much that it becomes a status thing. So if that's the way, you go at that one way. Some people want money because they want power, because it means I can basically get what I want quickly now, and I have power over other people. And some people have money because they want comfort. It's more of a negative. I don't want pain, and money enables me not to have it in various ways. I want convenience, I want comfort. Those. And so those... Sorry? Security, yeah. Okay, yeah. So it's a way of warding off fear in some ways. Like that, it means I've got control, so I'm not. So there's, as in from a Christian perspective, you mean? As in it's validating God's favour over me? Yeah. So it's almost like that. Those are the questions. I think it's like, what are people trying to get with this thing, and what are the answers that are most predominant? And almost you could do like another shape, you do like a bar chart of like, if we surveyed people in this city, what is the thing that they want money for? How much of it is status and validation and a sense of achievement? How much of it is security? How much of it is comfort? And you might go, vast majority of people, it's this. And there are that comment about the sense of divine favour in our church, to the extent that that might be more of an issue actually because of the influence of prosperity theology in the culture more widely, just in the particular part of the city we are. But I think that might be the thing to go to. Is like, how do we drill into what are people wanting money for? It's always going to be relevant. I mean, it's relevant in first century Galilee, and they did not have very much money going around. But it's like, why is it? What is the thing that people are trying to get with the money? I think that security of avoiding, like I'm hedged against the future because I've got money, so nothing can get me. And then you think, well, that's actually what you need to be looking somewhere else for.
What do you guys think it is? The security piece? Security and some status?
I think some is redemption.
Okay. In what way?
Giving people what they did not have. Many parents didn't grow up with good financial.
Okay.
They want their children to have that.
Right.
Children to have what they didn't have.
Okay.
In some sense, living out what they didn't have with their children.
Okay. So it's actually bound up with being a good parent and a good provider with them. So if that was let's say we said that was the primary issue. Actually, when we preach on money, which I presume we do. Steve just did 2 weeks ago in our church, but you'd have to then address that and say, ultimately, what do you want to even give your children? Because you can give them something that is a better inheritance. So of course you've got your text to say a good man gives hands up on an inheritance to his children, but the best inheritance you can give them is to say that even when you don't have those, you don't have the possessions, you have actually given something that is treasures that don't fail, and it doesn't fail you, it doesn't fail them, and then their hope is built on something that's everlasting. But you'd address it very differently than if it was the status one or the whatever. It's a really, really interesting conversation. I don't think there's any culture where money isn't an issue, but it's just it's an issue for very different reasons in different places. Okay. I'm aware it's now 11:05, so we'll make this the last one. Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we first asked us this question. What came to my mind was immigration, actually. Because in Singapore,
okay.
We accept many asylum seekers, illegal immigrants, we jail them and we kick them out.
Yeah.
I
think you're going to kick us out in about 3 days. Like.
In the West, that seems to be the opposite problem. And I just wonder, how does...
That's interesting.
How do you respond to... for us, we need to love the alien and all these people, host them more, but you're doing too much, and how do you respond?
Yeah. So I have preached on this actually, but not in the church I'm in London. So again, the 2 churches I've been a pastor in, the church in London, people are very. It's so diverse, and almost everybody has either got somebody who is an immigrant or recent immigrant in their immediate family. So it's not an issue where people need to have a sort of a bigger heart for the alien, the orphan. That's not. It might be for some, but that's not really a problem. Whereas when I was in Eastbourne, and it came up at the time of the Brexit referendum was happening, I spoke into sort of immigration and the way, and did it from Colossians 3, and sort of barbarian, Scythian, slave free, all that. And because I thought there is actually something to challenge here, that there is not for everybody, but there is a section, and in the end our town surprised me with actually how much more sort of closed borders people in my hometown would want to be. I was living in a bit of a bubble and I didn't really realise. And so I do think there's a place to do that even in preaching. I probably don't, my personal view would be that I don't think the issue is so much about whether or not it's sort of too welcoming versus not, in the sense of how, what from a policy perspective, I don't really feel like that's up to me, because I think that the dynamics affecting immigration numbers in different cultures are often much more down to, in our case, even just the number of people who speak English is just a big part of it. Lots of people are trying to get in, they're already in a safe country, they want to get into England, particularly because it's English speaking. And that's a public policy issue that I just don't really feel like as a preacher I particularly need to wade into. But I think it's making sure that the reasons why people in the church support, though, if they are like, no, we need much more closed borders, I want to go, is that just sort of prudence? Because it might be. But my sense was in Britain, and I suspect based on your question it would also be true here, that sometimes it is motivated more by a sense of either preserving the affluence we already have, I don't want it to get diluted, or sometimes xenophobia. And that may not be your case where you are, but I felt it was for us, and some of it is. And so I feel like that's going to be challenged with the gospel. There could be a bad heart that's underlying that, but I don't see it as my responsibility then to wade into, and here's why we should have a particular, this is a Christian border policy. I think I don't have access to that, and it will be interpreted so differently in different parts of the world. But I think if there's sin underneath people's resistance to immigration, then I think that does need to be challenged, even if it sounds political to people, because ultimately it's an issue of the heart, and it is part of my job to speak to. But in London, that's not our, I would say, in our church, that's not really our issue. Simon.
Can we put our hands together?